Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode here on Swish City. I'm your host, Bruce Veliz, and as you guys know, we are diving in and doing our off-season breakdown and season previews heading into this upcoming year as we are less than a month to go. Training camp has started for some specific teams already, and we're getting into the swing of NBA basketball once again. So today's episode, we're going to be diving and exploring, as you guys can see from the background, the Chicago Bulls. In today's episode, going over players that they added, players that they lost, looking at their depth chart, and overall predicting where I think the Bulls will fall this season. Without further ado, let's dive in. Let's get into it. If you want to make sure you stay up to date on everything, make sure to hit the subscribe button. Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments section, and let's get into it. So like I mentioned, we're going to be discussing the Chicago Bulls, and ultimately, I don't think the Chicago Bulls are going to do great in this Eastern Conference, even though the Eastern Conference did get a little bit weaker with teams at the top dealing with injuries to some superstar players like the Celtics and the Pacers, the two teams that have made it to the finals the last years out of the Eastern Conference. There are some still tough teams out there. There's obviously the Magic, who made some big moves bringing in Desmond Bane, the Knicks, who obviously made some big moves last season and now just got a new head coach, the Hawks, who are looking to change up things, the Pistons, who went on a big run and are looking to have Cade Cunningham rise, and many other younger teams as well, like the Sixers, Hornets, Raptors, all trying to get their mouths into the playoff situation, especially this season with some teams dealing with injuries. And ultimately, I think the Bulls just aren't going to have that enough firepower to do so. They have some intriguing names that we'll definitely get into that they have re-signed or brought back and done along those deals, but I do think for the Chicago Bulls, ultimately their roster is just not going to be able to stack up and compete against some of these top tier teams in the East, and that's where the Bulls are ultimately going to see themselves fall. But like I said, let's dive in and let's look at the Chicago Bulls. I want to give a huge shout out to my boss over on Bright Side of the Sun, John Voita. You guys should definitely check him out over on Suns Jam podcast. Not only does he talk about the Phoenix Suns, but he talks about the NBA as a whole over there, and he's the one that showed me how to do these templates over there, and it has been absolutely fantastic. Has saved me, maybe not in time to have to make these templates, but ultimately has saved me the better visual product here, and I am very, very grateful for everything he's done for me, not only in the Suns world, but helping me on smaller projects like this. So shout out to my boy John, definitely go check him out. But without further ado, let's dive in and let's talk about the Bulls. First, we're going to talk about these additions and get over that right away. Their one big addition this year was their trade that they made with the Cleveland Cavaliers. As we all know, the Bulls were looking to trade Lonzo Ball and Nikola Vucevic at the trade deadline last year. Unfortunately, due to some circumstances of their front office or maybe not getting what they wanted in those deals, who knows what to say. The Bulls are a mess as we all know it. They were unable to get the best value for Ball and Vucevic at the deadline. They still have Vucevic on this roster. We'll have to see how long he stays on this roster going into this season, but they did part ways with Lonzo Ball after restructuring his contract to make it a little bit easier for him to be traded this season, and they traded him away for Isaac Okoro. Now, this is a little bit weird with it obviously being a divisional trade. The Cavs lost some point guard help. They go bring in Lonzo. Lonzo was not really needed for the Chicago Bulls after coming back from years of dealing with this knee surgery and this knee issue. He actually looked pretty solid as a backup point guard and could present himself in a level winning team, or one that could be very competitive across the league, could bring some very solid, valuable minutes if he could stay healthy out there on the court. So far, he's been looked pretty solid when he's been there. If he can continue to do that, I think he'll be a good fit for the Cavs. But for the Bulls, Isaac Okoro comes in as a little bit of a plug-and-play piece. Over in Cleveland, he's obviously known as being a high draft pick going into the lottery, but not really panning out for this Cleveland Cavaliers team. He's supposed to be a defensive stopper, be a catch-and-shoot kind of scorer coming into the league, be someone that can kind of be an interchangeable piece, can grow on that wing and kind of fit in with those guys like Darius Garland, Evan Mobley, and Jaren Allen, obviously. Unfortunately for Okoro, the shot has not been able to transcend. He's not able to be that defensive stopper. Looks better on the defensive side, but offensively hasn't been able to take those leaps for the Cavaliers to imprint himself into that rotation, and seemingly was getting replaced over these last couple years with guys like DeAndre Hunter at last year's trade deadline, like Max Strus previously in the other free agency class. And because of that, Okoro had seemingly been falling out of his rotation, had been monitored in those trades, and now finds himself going to Chicago, looking to kind of be that complementary piece for a team here now. And ultimately, do I think he's going to blossom to be this nice top tier piece? Probably not, but could he be a nice complementary guy for those playmakers in Josh Giddey, Matas Buzelis, who's trying to take that rise as this dominant wing on this rotation? I definitely think so, and maybe he can find himself to be a rotational guy across the next couple years here in the league in a new home in Chicago. Now, the Bulls also went out and drafted 2 players. They went and got Noah Asenge, who was their first round selection at pick 12. A little bit of a questionable pick from some, but obviously Asenge has been known for his pretty solid defensive side of the basketball, where he can be a wing stopper. And ultimately, with Patrick Williams not really panning out at that position, with them taking him 4th overall just a couple years ago, it does look like the Bulls are trying to find another wing player to kind of put into this rotation to use on a cheaper contract, to maybe move off of a contract in Patrick Williams, so they don't necessarily need that. They also drafted Lachlan Olbrich, who they traded for within the Los Angeles Lakers for Rocco Zakarsky. Then that pick got flipped, so he ended up going to the Timberwolves, which we'll get into a little bit later. But yep, they bring those 2 players in. Noah Asenge, someone who doesn't really need the ball in his hands, kind of just a complimentary piece on the wing, pretty solid defender. We'll have to see how he breaks out. And then Lachlan Olbrich, a nice center coming into this rotation, who signed a 2-way deal. And if that's where we want to get into with the 2-way players, that's where the the Chicago Bulls come into play, with Yuki Kawamura coming from the Memphis Grizzlies and Brooklyn Nets over there. We got Emmanuel Miller, who had played on the Chicago Bulls team last season, and then Lachlan Olbrich coming in on the center position. Usually with 2 ways, you see 1 guard, 1 wing, 1 center, and the Bulls have identified that clearly they did to have to bring in Yuki Kawamura, have to waive someone who did just get recently picked up, which we'll talk about just in a little bit when we dive into the lost category. And that's where we are now. Like I mentioned, the Bulls traded 2 players, Rocco Zakarsky, who never was going to play for this team, as he was a draft selection and someone that they didn't have an eye on, so it doesn't really matter. And then Lonzo Ball, someone who had been signed just a couple years ago when they had this core of him, Zach LaVine, and DeMar DeRozan, Nikola Vucevic to take over the East. We did see that in the first half of the season, but ultimately injuries did catch up to the Chicago Bulls team, and it left them hindered, not only just Ball's career over this last couple seasons, but ultimately the core of the Chicago Bulls and their direction for their team. Ball obviously looking to bounce back with the Cavaliers and in a role where he can be that, hopefully secondary point guard behind Darius Garland and Donovan Mitchell playing in that bench unit. If he can stay healthy, I think can be pretty solid. We also see 2 other players leave the Chicago Bulls, and both of these were on 2-way contracts. EJ Liddell gets and leaves the Chicago Bulls. He signs a 2-way contract with the team we talked about yesterday's video, the Brooklyn Nets. Liddell was bounced around the league with some couple teams going, obviously drafted from the Pelicans, then getting traded to the Suns, then going to the Bulls, now going to the Brooklyn Nets. Ultimately hasn't been able to find his spot in the NBA, but maybe after a successful season in the G League could with the Nets. And then ultimately they lost Jameer Young as well. Young was someone who was waived for Yuki Kawamura, kind of plays a similar position, explosive offensive guard. They felt more confident in Yuki from seeing his performances across the G League and other teams compared to Jameer Young. But Jameer Young does land with the Miami Heat, and the Heat are known notoriously for getting guys around this G League level and making them stand out. Look at guys like Max Strus, who found himself in the league coming in from the G League. Gabe Vincent from those years with Jimmy Butler. Maybe Jameer Young is just another byproduct that they could see kind of blossoming into that, and we could see that expand over and from Miami. As a fan of an Eastern Conference team, I don't want to see that happen, but I think that that's a possibility. And then signing overseas, the one player that was on the Chicago Bulls team that is not going to be coming back is Talen Horton-Tucker. Ultimately, like I mentioned, since they added Lachlan Olbrich as a two-way, there's only one really roster spot open, as EJ Liddell and Jameer Young were both two-ways last year. They traded Lonzo for Isaac Okoro. There's only one roster spot really just has to be given up, and that's Taylor Horton Tucker's. After years of being held by the Los Angeles Lakers and then trying for other teams like the Jazz and the Bulls, trying to bring out the best in him, he is now going to be going over to Europe and playing it with Team Fenerbahce, which is a very popular team over in Europe. I'm excited to see what that can bring for him, but ultimately just wasn't really made for the NBA, didn't really stick in the NBA. Obviously, these last couple seasons has, but not as a key rotational guy, has been just kind of a depth piece across the league with people hoping on the hype of his name to really kind of take things for granted. But ultimately, Horton Tucker never really to pan out in the NBA. We'll have to see what that means for him going over to Europe. Can he shine bright like a diamond, or will he still stay the same THD? Alrighty, and that gets us to the depth chart, ladies and gentlemen, where we get to analyze things for the Chicago Bulls. Like I mentioned, looking at their depth chart, we can kind of see who they do have. They did bring back Josh Giddey. They recently just reworked that deal, the 4-year, $25 million contract for their point guard. Wanted closer to $30 million. The Bulls wanted to give him 18 to 20. They meet in the middle, coming in at 25. I don't think this is a bad deal for the guard. Obviously, when Zach LaVine left, he looked to be a little bit better in that position, having to be able to be ball dominant. But ultimately, I don't necessarily know if Josh Giddey is going to be one of these, top 5, top 10 point guards that we're necessarily looking around the league saying this guy is changing the game and taking the difference for his team. I ultimately just think on a bad Chicago Bulls team where he can be the number one option, he's going to look a lot better. So, and that kind of thing, we'll have to see how Giddey does grow. But playing alongside guys like Buzelis, Kobe White on the wing, having that low post threat in Nikola Vucevic down low could be very nice. Maybe even getting to utilize Noah Senguez on the wing could be a little bit better for Giddey. Then you got Kobe White, who was mentioned in those trade rumors kind of this season as a high-level scorer, has been able to kind of find himself through the Zach LaVine injuries and stuff like that. I really like Kobe White and what he's able to bring. Ultimately, though, once again, kind of just wasting away in Chicago, not on a playoff team. Could be a very solid, six-man kind of microwave scorer for one of those valuable teams as a playmaker and creator as well, but hasn't been able to find his way out of Chicago. Buzelis, obviously their number one pick last year, someone who, if he didn't go to G League Ignite, personally would have been a top 5 pick in my eyes with how his talent and with how he was able to come out of high school. He was such a raw prospect that he had the skills to prove that he could be that dominant player. Now, ultimately going to G League Ignite, not having the college eyes, not having as many scouts watching him as much, obviously hurts his stock, but he's been able to bounce back and look pretty solid on a Chicago Bulls team where he was one of the better rookies in last year's class, which was a little bit viewed as a weaker one. Then we get into the final two starters, Patrick Williams, Nikola Vucevic. To keep it straight, I think both of these guys should have been traded already. Williams was mentioned in trades last year centered around multiple other players. And just ultimately he has no value. And with his contract being $18 million with 3 more years remaining, with him only being a very defensive person, and that's in a nutshell, basically, not even a full grand scheme of what he can truly be. I don't know. Patrick Williams doesn't really excite me. Nikola Vucevic gotten a little bit older, mainly just an offensive rebounding big. Can't really play that much defense anymore. Got to insulate him with some solid defenders if you're going to want to have him be at his best ability, especially getting a little bit older, making $20 million, a little bit harder of a contract to trade. If I'm the Bulls, I'm just trying to get any value for these type of players so they don't just waste away and I lose them for nothing, and then I'm screwed with basically scraps once those players ultimately do retire. Now, when looking at this bench unit and kind of who they have in this depth chart, we can see that the Bulls do have some intriguing pieces compared to the Brooklyn Nets, but maybe not as valuable. Retrospectively, they did bring back Trey Jones, who has had some bouncing around, obviously played with the San Antonio Spurs, now going to the Chicago Bulls. But once again, with Josh Giddey, Kobe White, Ayo Dosunmu, there's really no fit for a guy in Trey Jones. It's one of their only 2 re-signings that they made alongside Josh Giddey. I like it to keep the value of the player. Trey Jones also looked a lot better with the Bulls in that second half stint. Maybe he can be a solid 6-man for this team. But once again, I feel like they already have so many similar archetypes on this roster already that they don't need, again, another just all-out scorer, offensive, heliocentric playmaker. Like I mentioned, Ayo Dosunmu, their backup shooting guard, kind of really do that. Kobe White can kind of really do that. Isaac Okoro now coming in. I don't know if he's going to come off the bench. I would have him come off the bench here, but kind of filling in as that backup small forward, catch and shoot scorer, pretty solid defender. We could see that. Noah Senge, like you mentioned, a little bit of a defensive stopper, wing guy, kind of doesn't need the ball in his hands to do things. We'll have to see how Patrick Williams can kind of translate. Maybe they do give a Senge the start over Williams because they're just fed up with Williams at this point, or maybe they want their rookie developed. Zach Collins ultimately had some shining spots in San Antonio a couple seasons ago, but then last year kind of fell off a cliff. We'll have to see how he looks. Could he be a solid backup center? Is he a tradable contract for this team down the line? 100%. But do I expect him to be a high impact player or someone that this team really values and giving playing time to? Most likely not. And then you got the guys towards the end of the rotation here, the bottom five, and some of them don't even really fit. As like I mentioned, you got Kevin Huerter, Dalen Terry, two other guards on this roster. Kevin Huerter, a little bit more of a veteran scorer, another tradable contract, someone that the Bulls maybe could use if they are selling at the deadline to maybe drop some picks and to drop some slots, get an extra pick, even if it is just a second rounder to help out into their youth movement. Javon Carter kind of falls into that same boat as well. Another defensive, or pretty solid defensive and playmaking veteran point guard who went to Chicago to kind of help them on their playoff run with those guys in Lonzo Ball, DeMar DeRozan, Nikola Vucevic, Zach LaVine, etc. Now with the direction kind of changing, I feel like Carter's path with this team necessarily isn't needed, specifically when they signed Trey Jones, still have Ayo Dosunmu, have Dalen Terry. I feel like Carter specifically as well on his $6 million contract is a very, very tradable one for the Chicago Bulls team to make. And then diving into the last two, Julian Phillips, who we did have highlighted here for you guys when we did show this crazy clip. Don't really know much about Julian Phillips. Like I said, I don't really watch the Chicago Bulls, but is it a nice, intriguing potential slashing wing for you guys? And then Jalen Smith, as we all know, picked by the Suns a couple years ago, has bounced around the league, gone to the Pacers, now with the Bulls here. A little bit of a tweener of that power forward center. I have him behind Senge and Williams just because I think Williams is going to start. Senge they're going to give the run to because he is the rookie. Maybe Smith comes and plays some backup center as well, kind of playing in with that Vucevic-Collins lineup because he can play a little bit of that small ball five. Maybe if Williams is hurt, if they don't really like Patrick Williams, he does split into that power forward slot. We'll have to wait and see ultimately where the Bulls come into play there. But Jalen Smith, ultimately, I think just kind of falls being into a rotation where they have too many players or kind of experimental guys that they're trying to figure out with Senge and Patrick Williams, or else he would be that backup power forward / center. So where does that ultimately leave the Chicago Bulls this season? Like I said, I did think they were going to be towards the bottom. That is right, 14th. As you guys can probably tell from these videos, we're going to be kind of going in order. It's my best to try to go in order. And yes, the Nets ultimately are going to be the worst. I do think the Bulls will fare a little bit better just because even though the Nets have Cam Thomas and Michael Porter Jr., some all-out scorers, I do think this Bull teams mesh a little bit more, and the Bulls don't have 5 rookies all trying to impress and trying to make themselves a spot in this rotation. At least the Bulls have some guys that have been here along the last couple years, some guys that can make some impacts, and some players that have shown across these last couple of seasons that they can be better than what the Bulls employ them to do, and I'm hoping for those players that the Bulls finally do realize this offseason that they're towards the bottom. Even in a weakened Eastern Conference, they can't do anything. So let's strip it down and let's finally restart. Let's invest in Buzelis. Let's invest in Josh Giddey. Let's invest into some of these younger guys like Noah Senge, maybe not Isaac Okoro. And let's move on from the Nikola Vucevic's, the Kobe Whites, the Javon Carters, the Kevin Huerters, the guys that are just holding up cap space on our team for basically no purpose and could provide some actual valuable scoring or whatever role they play on a team that actually needs them to compete. So let me know your thoughts down below in the comment section. Like I said, we're going to be diving and exploring every team before the start of the season. This is just episode 2. So if your team hasn't popped up yet, make sure to stay tuned because your team will be coming in the next couple of days. And if you did enjoy, let me know your thoughts down below in the comment section. But once again, I appreciate you all for tuning in. Have a great rest of your day and peace out.